We're looking at the good and the bad of what has happened so far in this NFL season, but also in NFL Week 3, where Shawn, Week 2 put up the points. Week 3 said, let me put up some more points, because this was an incredibly fun week of NFL football, fantasy football. We continued to see teams put up points. Some teams put up so many points that owners around the NFL are saying that they disrespected the league, because the Miami Dolphins put up 70 on the Denver Broncos. But a lot of fun, exciting, and we're going to dive into a lot of it on today's show. How are you feeling as we look like we're going to go in 100% win records here this week for the OT teams? Both the Dynasty Reanimators team put up 200 points with DeAndre Swift still to play, and it looks like we're going to get a main event win unless we get a Mike Evans 50-point night here on Monday Night Football. Monday Night Football, obviously a doubleheader again this week, so lots of implications, I'm sure, across many fantasy football leagues as we head into that. But Shawn, my goal for this week, my dream for this week, was that Week 3 would at least rival Week 2. I think it's exceeded it. How are you feeling as it closes out here with 2 more games to go?
Good. I mean, it's fun to have 2 more games to add even more massive points on what was an incredibly fun Sunday. Colm, are you serious about this comment about the Dolphins disrespecting the league?
Yeah, just before we started recording, I did see something, and Ben, I think, has commented on the subtweeted this tweet, and it's going pretty well for him. It might be getting some traction. There's no way I think anyone can be calling out the Dolphins for how it went. Ben's tweet is around the fact that the last 3 touchdowns were, a interception for a touchdown. And I think it was a 67-yard touchdown and a 65-yard touchdown rush, maybe, were the 2 touchdowns in the fourth quarter. So, yeah, the Broncos are that bad. I think the Denver Broncos disrespected the league more than anything.
Yeah, I mean, the Denver Broncos disrespected the league by what they did last year with Nathaniel Hackett, and they've been disrespecting the league with how they played yesterday. But the other 30 teams also are culprits here, where the Miami Dolphins have gone out and tried to get football players to score points and win games. And you've got teams like the Minnesota Vikings cutting Dalvin Cook. I mean, what's more disrespectful to the league? I mean, this is flagrant absurdity. I mean, that kind of thing gets me really wound up, because this is competition, right? If anything, it's disrespectful to have to kneel at the end of NFL games.
Like, which is more disrespectful, that the Chiefs take Mahomes? I know Mahomes was carrying an injury in that game, but take Mahomes out and put in Blaine Gabbert, who throws 2 interceptions, and it's kind of like they're having a pity party for the Chicago Bears at that point. Which is more disrespectful, that the team thinks that you are so bad that we sub in all the second stringers, or that we try and play the game properly?
Yeah, I mean, that kind of thing I've always found frustrating, because I mean, no one likes to be humiliated, but the whole point of competition is that you play hard all the way and you don't disrespect your opponent by not trying. And I mean, there are some situations like you see with the Chiefs and, even with the Dolphins there, where, I mean, they are taking it easy on the opponent. There's not an intent to run up the score necessarily, but again, that's more humiliating than the opposite. And I mean, it's the right way to play it by the teams that are ahead. And yet,
and there's a real difficult balance sometimes in the NFL. We do see come from behind victories, in the NFL quite a bit, and it gets to the stage, sometimes at halftime, that I feel like teams might be like, well, we have them, just let's see it through, let's not get any injuries, and then all of a sudden you get to the last 3 minutes of the fourth quarter, and you're like, well, we need a field goal here to try and get to overtime or something like that. I think that one of the things the Patriots did for so long, so well, was when a team was in trouble, they put their kind of foot on their neck and finished the job. And I think that talking about one team kind of boat racing another team and saying it's disrespectful to the league, I think is a little bit embarrassing for those owners. Now, the owners, Shawn, I'm sure they will remain anonymous, but a little bit of embarrassment.
I'll tell you what's disrespectful to the league and embarrassing is a flurry of 2-yard passes. The Miami Dolphins understand that you win games by scoring points, and you score points by putting the fastest players on the field, opening holes for them, and letting them run to daylight. Again, just if you are ever complaining about the margin that you are losing anything by, then you are not a competitor. And people who are going to come out and win the next game get fired up and go practice harder. They make better decisions. They call better plays the next game, and they get better. That's something that also the Denver Broncos are going to do, right? I mean, they've got some problems, but I mean, was there a situation in this game where they didn't look like they were engaged? I mean, they weren't competitive.
The Miami Dolphins didn't.
I mean, they continued to throw long bombs to Marvin Mims. He was running for 99-yard touchdowns. I mean, this game would have had like 130 points if Courtland Sutton didn't fumble like every time he touched the ball, right? I mean, the Broncos were engaged in this game. It was exciting specifically because the NFL product wasn't terrible. If you're an NFL owner and you're talking about this being disrespectful, then you have no idea how bad your product was for the last 2 years.
We've got Shawn fired up. I love it. I love it to start the show. I find the statement, it was speaking to multiple NFL owners. I'm told there's a common feeling that the Dolphins head coach, Mike McDaniel, running up the score on the Broncos was, quote, disrespectful to the game of football. Imagine how much they would have ran up the score here if they also had Jalen Waddle available.
Well, imagine what they could have done in that game if they actually wanted to be disrespectful.
Yeah. So I think we're looking at winners and losers, or good and bad. The first one is the Miami Dolphins. We've talked enough about them. Shawn will say that they are the first ones. We had just an amazing game in Miami. We got Mostert with 4 touchdowns. We get Devin Achane with 4 touchdowns. We get when a stadium gasps at a play, Shawn, it is always a really, really cool kind of sign. But the kind of no luck dump off sideways pass that Tua does to Achane on that touchdown when the entire stadium gasps is a pretty cool audio sound. But this is it was a special performance by the Dolphins and a big win. Obviously, highly focused on the 2 running backs and Tyreek Hill, all kind of running there. We were joking before the show started. I seen a team that had both Mostert and Achane at running back over at the FFPC that I think it combined 95 points maybe from the 2 running back spots, which is absolutely incredible. So I'm hoping that we continue to see more of this from Miami, force the hand of the other teams around the league to try and put up those points. You mentioned Marvin Mims as well, returned for a touchdown. So really fun game. I enjoyed it a heck of a lot. So we'll start off. The Miami Dolphins are the big winner of this particular week, week 3. I think they're going to be the big winner of the NFL season. Mike McDaniel has done an amazing job. I seen a quote from him, and I don't know if it was from recently or from when he was hired, but he talked about he was going to try and do things that hadn't been done before, because if you're doing stuff that teams already know about, then the defenses have the advantage. And we're seeing defenses have the advantage. We've seen that in week 1. We haven't really seen it in 2 and 3, thankfully. But hopefully with some of this innovation, some of the stuff they were doing in terms of the motions and players starting at wide receivers for end arounds with a lead blocker and things like that had them huge success in this particular game. Seeing that innovation hopefully will start to have some of the offenses around the NFL copy it a little bit and put those defenses on the back foot. Shawn, I don't know who you want to go to for the first big winner, but I'm going to just mention the name Sam LaPorta. And I've been going with SLP in some of our recent emails back and forth. And I hadn't said to Shawn, that's what I'm going with now for Sam LaPorta. I was thinking today, I was like, what else could it be? And I thought of like S-La-P. And then I was like, well, that would spell slap. So maybe that doesn't work out. But SLP is what I'm going to refer to him from now on, Shawn. But first tight end in NFL history to start their career with 5+ receptions in their first 3 games. Gets in the end zone. We talked about last week. In Dynasty, you've moved him up to the tight end 2. Maybe he'll start to even get edged into the tight end 1, but he is somebody now that he's found that end zone, that everything that, if I just talked about the perfect start to the season from our off-season hype for Sam LaPorta and how the other rookie tight ends have fared through the opening 3 weeks of the season, I think LaPorta has got to be one of the absolute biggest winners through 3 weeks.
It's been phenomenal. And you look at kind of where he is in the target pecking order for Detroit. That's extremely encouraging. Ben and I broke down his week 3 performance in great detail on the Stealing Bananas episode, so make sure you check that out if you're interested. Colm, we were getting a lot of sort of R2 plus trade offers for him. Now started to get a bunch of round 1 trade offers for LaPorta. That's not enough, right? So don't give LaPorta away. I mean, you're talking about being in the early stages of, a George Kittle type of performance. It's going to be difficult to have anyone really hit the heights of Travis Kelce with a Patrick Mahomes, both because, Sam LaPorta is not going to have Patrick Mahomes, and they're probably going to have better weapons around him than Kelce's had. So when you have that great of a quarterback, that great of a play caller, Andy Reid, and then you actually have very weak receivers, you end up with these monster seasons for Travis Kelce. I wouldn't expect that. But when you think about the age that LaPorta is, and you think about the situation here where so many of the guys have emerged somewhat late in their careers, to be able to get so many potential seasons from LaPorta and for it to be so big right away. He was definitely one of our very top priority targets. I think that he ended up as my highest rostered player in Underdog. To have hit on that portion of it when tight end is so difficult, it just changes every league that he is in. Very exciting to be in that situation. And again, Colm, as we're kind of looking to put these teams together, the Dolphins was probably the team that we had the most exposure to for all of the things that we saw on Sunday. You mentioned the copycatting. One of the things that's going to be very difficult for teams to be able to, the speed. And so the Dolphins,
you mentioned about they're getting players that are very good. They're also getting players who are very fast, extremely fast.
Yeah, and there are even some former RotoViz people in the Dolphins organization there. You can't overnight, within the course of a couple of weeks, put together what the Dolphins have put together with their intentionality over years of acquiring that much team speed. And so again, we get back to this idea of disrespecting the league. And it's just real sour grapes in terms of realizing that your tactics, your approach over multiple seasons was going directly down the wrong path. And so to see the Dolphins be so successful with this has been a lot of fun. Colm, the flip side is that certainly not everything has gone exactly according to plan. It was exciting to see the 200 points in our Dynasty League. That always a lot of fun when we featured that team in the Dynasty Reanimators series. One of the things that's been cool about that team is the variety of ways that it has to win. One of the big decisions we made in the offseason was to, obviously not to move Tua, to trade for a Matthew Stafford, to not trade a Raheem Mostert, and to be willing to trade an Alexander Mattison, even though the prices on those guys would suggest that the other way around would be the way to do it. The Dynasty League team, I think, is a really good example of putting together win big types of players and a win big overall philosophy there. One of the things that's kind of fun about our main event team that's going to score 150 this week, and you could easily score 150 this week and lose, right? But 150 is still a good score. That team doesn't actually have a lot of the players who participated in the huge fireworks this week, but we want to win big. We want to lose small. For the most part, we are accomplishing that, but certainly the week 3 performance from Sam Howell was not nearly as strong, able to put up the 200 points with just 0.6 from him. The Washington Commanders having a lot of trouble with their offensive line, providing him any time. The pressure has been an issue throughout, certainly was a huge issue in week 3. And the other part of that is that when we think about disappointments, we're not getting the breakout from Jahan Dotson. Yeah. And so there will be listeners who, like, Sam Howell didn't really fit our plan for the year. However, our teams were put together in the contests we were involved in, but we did still have interest in Jahan Dotson. That part not hitting has been extremely frustrating. Curtis Samuel, Terry McLaurin, the leading receivers in this game, and even them, obviously, more or less stopped. And then Colm, the other one that is just incredibly disappointing now, JSN taking a big step back in week 3. Through 2 weeks, disappointing, but certainly not catastrophic by any stretch. And again, you've got a long season here. One of the reasons that you're drafting to win at every round in the draft, you think about some of the teams where maybe we have a Kyle Pitts and still come back and take a Sam LaPorta. you're drafting those guys in the first 5-6 rounds, thinking of those players as starters, but then continuing to layer in guys who can put up big numbers in 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. You think about Rashee Rice, you mentioned, tackled at the 6-inch line a couple times. He's somebody who looks like he'll be playable for us. Marvin Mims. I mean, you've got some pretty crazy notes here on
if
the
you
show
get
sheet
him,
with him.
to run some more routes, Shawn, he could be the greatest receiver of all time.
That might be.
He's run 27 routes this season. He has 9 targets. He has 197 yards. And then obviously he had a return for a touchdown yesterday as well. He looks pretty good.
And this is kind of what we're hoping for the different young receivers, especially the guys who weren't extremely early picks, is that you make plays and you force your way onto the field. You think about the contrast between Mims and one of the values in watching the games from time to time. People say, well, if it doesn't actually show up in points, then it probably doesn't matter. But you think about the Broncos side of this game with the Dolphins. And I mean, the Broncos have actually been a lot of fun. This is a situation where, I mean, Russell Wilson throws for over 300 yards. He could have had more touchdowns. You have, really a borderline bogus penalty that wipes out a Jerry Jeudy touchdown. Courtland Sutton, 11 targets, 8 catches, 91 yards, a touchdown. If you drafted Courtland Sutton, and he was basically going kind of right there at the back end of the wide receiver window, I mean, you're going to be very happy with that game if you didn't watch and see how poorly he played. Mm-hmm. Brandon Johnson, somebody who managed to put up some sort of fluky points over the first couple of weeks. He has the 3 targets, just the 2 catches for 12 yards in this, but also commits multiple back-breaking penalties. And when you look at Mims and what he does, he does not necessarily doing the same types of things, or is not going to fill the same type of role as a Brandon Johnson or a Courtland Sutton. And so it's not like a 1-for-1, just swap him in and move those guys out. I mean, Courtland Sutton is not going to be going to the bench in 2023 for huge stretches or anything like that. But when we think about how the play calling will evolve for this team, the contrast between Mims and Sutton is already so severe that if you have Mims, I think you've got to be excited. If you have Sutton, there's at least a little bit of a sense of maybe I'm going to sell high here. Although, again, they're getting these guys open. They're getting volume to him. Jerry Jeudy only has the 5 catches. I mean, his line, because he doesn't get the touchdown, far below the Sutton line, but he does have an efficient game, 16 yards per catch. He had a really deep target on top of that.
He looks fully healthy, which I wrote as a positive.
He does look healthy. And he had a deep target that was thrown into double coverage where, I mean, his chances of actually coming down with the ball were very minimal. But one of the things that you do want to see is an air yards element for Jeudy. And so fired up about some of those kinds of things. I mean, those are big positives. And when you think about some of those guys and then the contrast to JSN, who was just phased out of this game completely. I mean, sometimes you can have a down game and things just missed. I mean, this wasn't that, right? I mean, he was barely involved, and
it was concerning in terms of how he wasn't very involved the other weeks, but he was getting the targets, and he, like last week, for example, in week 2, he has 5 catches just for the 34 yards, but this week 1 catch for 10 yards, and in a game where it's 37-27 between the Seahawks and the Panthers, but there's a lot of points being put up, there's a lot of yards being put up, and it was concerning to see his lack of usage. And I guess what I would put in with that is, you mentioned Dotson as well, and he has yet to go over 10 PPR points this season, and I guess we can say the same about JSN, but I thought Dotson was going to start this season and just be ready to hit the ground running, and that breakout was starting from the start, whereas I thought JSN, and then particularly with the preseason injury, may have been a case where, like, if his wrist injury didn't have him back as soon as he was, which was a lot sooner than people expected, and he's on IR and he comes back in week 4, week 5, then we could, see a different picture. But he is active these weeks and he looks like he is healthy. There's no concerns around the wrist, so he's not been involved. But Dotson has really struggled so far. The other part of that is with those 2 guys, is there one of them that, do you think both of them come good as the season progresses? Are you where's your, I guess, panic meter at this point in time? And then with Howell as well, he's obviously tied to Dotson. I think we're going to see some weeks like this for him. He had a really terrible pick 6 in this one, took a huge amount of sacks. But the Buffalo Bills sometimes will absolutely wreck your game plan and put you into situations where you have to pass, there's no balance, and Washington really struggled the whole way throughout this game. So Dotson and JSN, where's the panic meter at for Shawn Siegele?
You have to understand that eventually the talent is going to win out. And yet these are short seasons, right? When you talk about being through 3 weeks and not getting production, then, I mean, you've already really hurt the teams. And there's not exactly an end in sight for either player. In that, I mean, the concern with Dotson coming in was that he has this good, not great prospect profile, and then his ability to command targets as a rookie was mediocre. Now, what he did with those targets was exceptional. And anybody who's read Blair's work on this subject knows that that is an extremely strong positive indicator for future volume. And it's going to be a great indicator when you're someone who finished out your college career as a star, you're someone who is drafted extremely early, you're someone who is in a rising, potentially dynamic offense. But even with those things in place, if you are not commanding the targets, and Terry McLaurin has, more or less reemerged as the alpha there. And it's not that you can't support multiple players, but I mean, you've got to force yourself into that mix and you've got to make plays. And I don't get the impression that these guys are necessarily doing that right now for Sam Howell. I quit watching this game before the pick 6. The first 3 interceptions didn't worry me that much, and I felt like he looked good and they were moving the ball. And you contrast that with the Atlanta Falcons, who weren't doing anything. I mean, the Commanders had the ball down in the red zone multiple times. If things go barely differently, and not only do they not get humiliated, but they potentially even win that game. And the other thing that is just very positive, again, the Cardinals, and we'll talk about in a second, they actually look like a very good NFL team. That win that the Commanders had in week 1 is looking better and better. You're 2-1, you're going forward. I mean, there are plenty of reasons to be optimistic and to be patient there. Certainly wouldn't unload Dotson in Dynasty, but there's no question that the worst case scenario is playing out for him specifically, right? I think you've got to be very concerned. I don't think you can play him if you have a good team. I mean, if you have injuries, if you have holes, if really your only path to being successful this season is a big bounce back from him, then, I mean, you stick with it and you're there when he does have the big game. But right now, if you have any other options, you've got to bench both of these guys. And I mean, the panic is also, I mean, not panic per se, but I mean, the situation with JSN is really dark right now. I would never have believed that we could get to this point. And so certainly you are admitting, pretty epic failure on that projection, that piece of analysis, looking at what he's going to do. And certainly all the skeptics look, golden right now in terms of
but things can change very quickly in the NFL. It looks really bad now, and it may continue to look really bad. But, it is 3 weeks in. We've seen in the past lots of players have issues as they move in and then turn around as the season goes along.
Right. And I'm not saying that can't happen. I mean, I think that's the more likely thing to happen. But, I mean, that's one of the risks when you take a player like that early.
Yeah, in the top 10 picks.
You need to draft a lot of other good players because you're just simply not going to be able to play one of your early picks in the early going. I mean, you're not going to be able to play him next week, even if he has a good game. Again, if you have a good team, you probably can't play him the week after that because you need some confirmation. Now we're, fairly deep into the season. So, I mean, that's one of the issues with having a bad start is that not only do you bank some negative scores, but you're also just not then able to play the player, which means that the first 1 to 2 really good games, you probably don't get either because they'll be on your bench. Then you think
there'll
about the number of situations where A-Chain is on
That's what I was
people's
about to
benches
say.
this week.
Yeah. There's going to be quite a few of them that people had sitting on their bench.
And with A-Chain, I mean, in many cases, those teams are probably still going to be fine. Now, you wish you had the points in because there's no way that you could replicate somebody who goes off for, a 200-plus yard game. But yeah, it's bad. And all of the elements of it that could be negative are playing out in a negative way, where the other two receivers are playing reasonably well. They're not playing great, but they're playing reasonably well. They're way ahead in the pecking order. The running backs both look very, very good. And Geno Smith looks pretty mediocre. I mean, one of the things that you're looking at with JSN is you have to look back on these situations and also ask yourself the question, like, would you do it again? Right? Because if you would do it again, then you feel very good about the analysis. You don't feel good about the outcome. If you wouldn't do it again, then you've identified a flaw in the analysis or a flaw in the process that has led you to make a decision that you would change in future years. And continuing to evaluate all of those kinds of things are very important, because if you do have flaws in your process, even if you're successful, and in some cases, especially if you're successful, I mean, if you're not really that good at fantasy football, it doesn't matter that much if you fix a flaw, because you're going to move from not that great to maybe mediocre. Now, you can fix a lot of flaws and you can over time become very good. I wouldn't, discourage anyone from trying to improve. It's like the thing we started the show with. Like, if you're not good at something, don't complain about the people who are awesome. Make yourself better. Wrapping back around into what I originally started saying there. For me, with JSN, when you look at their decision to draft him, and you look at what he did as a college player, and you look at where Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave have been, you look at the fact that JSN has agility numbers that are absolutely unreal. And so there is athleticism to go with it. One of the things right now is that you've got a guy who, because of the way he's being used, looks small and slow out there, which is, again, not what you're looking for at all, right? But based on where we were coming in with this, I think that you could very reasonably expect Puka Nacua light types of games. He's on a historic pace. You wouldn't expect that. But a version of that where he is very involved in the offense, I think, was the most likely scenario. Not a likely scenario or the upside scenario or a scenario you're shooting for. I think it was the most likely one. That's not at all what we've gotten. And the information that we now have is so clear and convincing in terms of where he is, that now you have to have patience, and you have to be looking, a month into the future to where you might accomplish that. Because at least based off of this most recent game, there's absolutely no reason to think that you're going to get that in the next couple of weeks.
We're going to go into another positive. I'm going to let Shawn pick this one, but I have a feeling, are we going to lean towards Keenan Allen here?
Well, Keenan Allen looked good, didn't he?
Pretty good. Had a pretty good game. A few notes here for Keenan. Only player in NFL history with 3 games of at least 15 catches. Most receptions in a game this season at 18 receptions, Shawn. Tied at most receiving yards in a game this season. Just the 215 receiving yards. He had a 49-yard touchdown pass to Mike Williams, who unfortunately, Mike Williams has been confirmed will miss the rest of the season with a knee injury. But he had career high receptions in this game, career high receiving yards in this game. And he's doing this as we have, players, Shawn, who get older and, we fade them or we don't want them on our rosters anymore. Keenan Allen feels like he is, the old saying, he is aging like a fine wine here. He is getting even better than he has ever been. We had him with Phillip Rivers, where he was just a target monster. But now this was just super impressive, and to build on what he did last week as well.
He looks so good. And the fun element here, I think, and certainly something that I hope our listeners have been able to take advantage of, is that the idea that you wanted to play the 3-4 turn as Keenan Allen and Deebo Samuel, that's been more or less perfect so far. And you think about the weakness of some of the receivers in 3, think about the injuries, unfortunately, some of the receivers in that 3, 4, 5 range. You think about, what's happened with some of these guys in terms of DJ Moore, who did manage garbage time success to be able to rescue, his fantasy
salvage
managers
maybe
to salvage the game there. But you look at Deebo, and obviously you get the long touchdown toward the end that really helps, but the 12 targets there, that's what you want to see when Brandon Ayuk is out. That's one of the reasons that you have that thesis in favor of, number one, with the 49ers, you're getting a similar type of thing that you're getting with the Dolphins, right? Is that you can fade the volume elements slightly because your efficiency upside is absolutely gigantic. And so when you get the 21 combined targets for Samuel and Kittle in this game, it was great for all of those Kittle shares to get a 7 and 90, especially in tight end premium where those 7 receptions play up. Then you get the full 5 catches from Christian McCaffrey. He pulls down all of his targets. To get 26 targets for those 3 guys when Ayuk is out, I mean, that's what you're desperately hoping for, looking for. You get that performance on Thursday night, and then you come back on Sunday and you get the massive performance from Keenan Allen. And Keenan Allen was one of the 2 or 3. I mean, Justin Jefferson's there even with the debacle in week 17, but Keenan Allen was the best receiver in the NFL down the stretch last year. To be in an environment where we have so many receivers drafted in rounds 1 and round 2, it was bizarre that he wasn't more expensive. And so to be able to have gotten so many shares of that and of Samuel, especially early, but even pulling into the late time period, that part I think is extremely exciting. And so then the flip side, Colm, is that the bad news there is that if we could have played the 1-2 turn better, then you'd be in better shape. The Aaron Rodgers injury becomes even more devastating when you look at it within the context of what Davante Adams has been able to do. Obviously, we had the concussion for Jacoby Myers that took him out of week 2, and Davante Adams has a big game there. But both of those guys are available in this one. They combined for 32 targets. 20 targets.
Yeah, 44 total targets. They have 32 of them.
Well, one of the issues here is that if you give 19 carries to Najee Harris, you're going to actually not control the ball on your side at all. You're going to create an environment where the other team can throw 44 times. This is kind of a weird one where if you're rooting against Davante Adams, then you're also like, man, I wish Josh Jacobs would be a little bit more efficient. I wish they could use him more. I mean, this is a game where every time there's a handoff, again, it's that thing of going back to the Miami thing over and over and over, where it's like, maybe instead of complaining, you should build a better team. Josh Jacobs and Najee Harris are not the ways to win in 2023. When you have players like that, then if you have a good receiver, and right now, I mean, George Pickens, 4 for 75, a decent game. Sadly, Kenny Pickett looked very mediocre. Hey, he averages over 8 yards per attempt. He throws a couple of touchdowns. I mean, mostly you just can't give all those running back carries that torpedo all of those drives.
There is part of me that, they are torpedoing drives, but I think part of it is as well, they are limiting some of what they're wanting Kenny Pickett to do in terms of probably their expectations may have adjusted since the preseason on what he maybe can achieve. And I think that's why we're seeing, 31 rush attempts for the team versus 28 pass attempts. This is one, Shawn, though, when you look at the box score, you're like, oh yeah, this game was, the Raiders easily won this game, but they didn't. They lost 23-18. The Steelers have a really strong defense, but Davante Adams, Shawn, is, I've said this before, one of my all-time favorite players. I have a Davante Adams jersey on my wall here. Nobody can see it. It's over this side, but I used to mention to you on this show that Davante Adams is top 2 and he's not number 2 as a wide receiver. He may not be that level anymore, but I think he's a future Hall of Famer, and we're continuing to see what he is able to do in terms of 13 for 172 and 2 touchdowns, and a bit like we see with for example, Tyreek Hill or Keenan Allen, I don't think this is the last time we see Davante Adams put up a massive game like this season. And when we're talking massive games, we're talking astronomical fantasy numbers here.
Yeah, and Jimmy Garoppolo, obviously plenty of mistakes in this one. 3 picks, 4 sacks. And yet,
I think part of that as well is when the game has to be in Jimmy Garoppolo's hands, he can make throws, and he can make a lot of throws, but when he's forced to throw it 44 times, he is going to make some mistakes as well.
That's true. And I think that one of the things you're seeing here is the difference between Jimmy Garoppolo with Kyle Shanahan and the 49ers versus Jimmy Garoppolo with Josh McDaniels and the Raiders. But the thing that you love to see if you're a fantasy manager who has these players is you get 32 targets for the 2 main guys. You're not wasting a ton of time on the other players. You get the 5 targets for Josh Jacobs. You're obviously keeping him involved. That gets Jacobs up to 22 touches. Again, that's probably about where you want him to be, even if in a game like this. I mean, one of the problems that you have with these bruising backs is that anytime you come in with an opponent who is big and physical on defense, who has the type of impact players that the Pittsburgh Steelers have, then a player like Josh Jacobs isn't worth very much. And what you need are the receivers. What you need are the running backs with speed. And so you kind of think through how these games are going to work. And certainly you can get into a situation deep in the playoffs where maybe you're not even facing those teams. You think about the Bengals, that's not necessarily a team that is going to neutralize Josh Jacobs. The Kansas City Chiefs, they haven't necessarily had the type of defense that's going to neutralize a Josh Jacobs. They may now. They look awfully good the last couple of weeks, although, especially after what we saw from the Jaguars against the Texans, the Chiefs' 2 wins over the Jaguars and the Bears may end up just being a situation where, a good team is going to humiliate those opponents. So maybe if you're in the AFC and you're looking at some of the best teams, maybe that works. But when you think about the Philadelphia Eagles, they have had some issues in run defense, but they have a lot of power now on the defensive line. Certainly the San Francisco 49ers have powerful defense that's going to take those players out of the equation. Why would you build around? And this kind of goes back to this element where the Raiders had some skepticism, and there have been so many issues between the Raiders and Josh Jacobs. But if a good defense or a defense with certain traits completely wipes out your running back, then he doesn't do what you need, right? And you contrast that with a player like Bijan Robinson. Now, Bijan Robinson was limited in this last game, but that's more a structural element with the Falcons than him specifically or the defense. You think about a guy like a Jonathan Taylor, there are differences. And one of the issues that we had with these running backs who were franchise tagged, and I'm all in favor of the players getting paid. The number one thing I think is you have to shift the way the rookie salaries work, because now the early portion of the contract for NFL players, and especially when you think through how short the careers are for so many people, the exploitation element there of rookie contracts is so severe. You've got to fix that problem. It's not any way, shape, or form that we are saying that these players shouldn't be paid. You look at some of the issues these teams are having is that the team also understands that the big grinding back, all that they do is soak up a certain number of touches in a game that take those plays out of the game, which may or may not help you, but certainly doesn't win the game for you or change the game for you. You're getting back here to Davante Adams as being the player who matters. And, a good performance in some ways by the Pittsburgh Steelers defense. I think that you have to limit the overall praise for a defense, though, when they gave up 172 yards and 2 touchdowns to any individual player.
We're going to have a few more here as we get ready to close out the show. But, Shawn, I'm going to mention too, one lighthearted, maybe not lighthearted, you might want to follow up on it. I don't know if you'll agree. And the other one, just for me personally, the Packers yesterday, the bad was the first 3 quarters. The good was the last quarter. Shawn hasn't got to watch all of this game yet, but I'm just going to say I thought Jordan Love balled out in the 4th quarter, and we're going to have some discussions because I still think there's something really there with Jordan Love moving forward. So it's going to be fun. We're missing a lot of players for the Packers on offense. We're also missing a lot of salary cap with Aaron Rodgers no longer with the Green Bay Packers. So they eke it out at the end, which was one that I had completely tuned out of. And then they won, which was an unusual feeling, a nice feeling. I wore my Packers hat for this recording. But the Packers get the good. But on the bad, and I don't know if people agree with this, but I'm finding the commentary teams, the commentary booth, the analysis during these games to be way too positive and way too flowery around terrible players. And I'm noticing it more on island games, but I don't know. Like they're always talking about like, oh, the team loves this guy and he's got this attitude and he's so great. And you're like, this player is terrible. Why are we talking him up? I know they have a product to sell and they want to keep you watching the game, but is that something that you're noticing? Are you watching the games in complete silence? How are you doing it, Shawn? I need to hear. I mentioned earlier, I need to hear like the crowd reaction to these incredible plays. But can I get a version that has nobody else talking?
I've been okay with the commentary. I certainly won't pick out any individual teams in the same way that, if you don't like overtime, you can not like it. Just keep it to yourself. But
the podcast or the NFL extended game?
Well, everybody likes the extended game. Come on. I mean,
I hope everyone likes the overtime podcast as well. Here, Shawn, this is
everyone who got to 41 minutes into the overtime podcast probably likes it all right. Yeah. When you are having a denial of reality type of broadcast, that is always a little bit tricky.
That's a good way to put it, actually. That's a good way to put it.
But we get lots of insights from the commentators, and I do think that enthusiasm in general for the product and for the individual people is always a lot of fun. Colm, you and I recorded a best ball draft with David Philippi a few weeks ago. He was one of the secondary winners of our rating and review contest. And he started a Substack. He wrote a beautiful post that I won't give too many spoilers to, but anybody who has any interest in a piece that combines both football, fantasy football, and life in a really compelling and meaningful way, make sure you check that out. Certainly, if you're following Dave, you'll be able to make your way to that piece. One of the things he mentions in there, and probably people who are more involved in some of the social media stuff, as I am not, will have just seen this weeks ago and know that it's out there. But one of the elements that I think is just very, very upsetting is the way that fans interact with players. And he had mentioned in his article about being excited to have DeAndre Swift and not Alexander Mattison. That's a little bit more of a one-off kind of thing. That's not what the article is about. And then feeling bad in the aftermath of that when you hear about some of the reactions that Mattison has gotten to things that have happened in a football game, and including many things of racist direction. It's terrible. It's unfathomable that people would act like that. It's completely justified to talk about what performers are doing on the field. And it's the interest, it's the analysis, it's the meaningfulness that it brings to people's lives because they share both the fantasy football experience and the real football experience in a way that is very meaningful to them and it is a big chunk of their lives. People don't pay for tickets, go stand out in the freezing cold without shirts, wave around their towels, do all of these types of things. It's not a community and cultural experience. You think about how our cultural experiences have evolved as societies to where, still you could argue that a lot of them are unsavory in some ways, but they're very different than when, people are cheering for wild animals, tearing captives to shreds and things like that. We've moved in what I would say is a better direction. And we have these communal and cultural experiences that can be very positive. And because these individual people who are human beings are the central characters in that play, they put themselves in a position to be discussed as football players, but certainly never as people and never as targets for the type of vitriol that they receive in ways that go beyond football. And just so for me, when we have these NFL games, and one of the things that's going to happen with a commentator that's very different from analysts who are more a step or two removed like we are, is simply they have relationships with some of these people. Yeah. And you go and interview them and talk with them on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, whenever those different meetings happen, and have these great experiences. You're not going to then go in the booth on Sunday and be like, "Yep, that dude is awful at stuff." It's just, it's a different dynamic. And I think it is positive, and that it does at least offset some of the things that people, for whatever reason, don't understand is not appropriate. And so I love the players. I love the players who, we're not necessarily rooting for. I mean, I felt very strongly that Adam Thielen was washed coming into this season, and that having him as any part of an offense that you're trying to build around and help Bryce become an NFL QB, that was just so damaging to the young quarterback. You get Andy Dalton out there for a week, and Colm, what do we get from Adam Thielen in this game? Like 11 for 145 and 1. It just,
Shawn, could you have told? I don't know anyone that could have told us before this season. I don't know if you felt the same way, but watching this game and seeing Andy Dalton and Adam Thielen, trying to mount this comeback, I was hyped watching this. As he has 14 targets, 11 receptions, 145, and a touchdown. But it felt like we had gone back in a time. It felt like we were in a time machine.
Andy Dalton has been in the NFL for literally forever, right? Literally in the Archer
just the 58
sense
pass
of
attempts
forever.
in this one. 58 pass attempts.
58. I think it was a career high for someone who, again, has been in the NFL seemingly for decades, right?
Drafted in 2011. So he's been about.
So I guess really not that long. I certainly have done.
That's a long time in the NFL. He's 30. He's 35 years old, Shawn. He's been in the NFL. At this point, I would just guessing. I'd say this is his 12th or 13th season. Then at that point, that's a long time. That would have a child that has been born, goes through regular school, and is heading into high school now. We're in that age range.
Okay. Yes. But DJ Chark, 11 targets in this game. I mean, the plan that the Panthers went with this offseason didn't make any sense. And at this point, I think they have to be very chagrined that they don't have Stroud, maybe even Richardson. It's still going to be very positive for them in the long run, I think. And yet, when you have a game here where Adam Thielen and DJ Chark combined for 25 targets and also well over 200 yards and 2 touchdowns. I mean, this is a very humorous. This was
a fever dream, Shawn, when this game was going on.
Just so much weirdness. It also is kind of weird because I was saying on Stealing Bananas that Miles Sanders had a great game. I think if you were just looking at the box score, you're like, what is Shawn talking about? Because he was 9 for 24 on the ground, 5 for 38 through the air on 9 targets, which means he has a lot of targets there that don't actually go anywhere. He does score a touchdown. But again, I mean, he looked good, and Chuba was not involved, which was weird and disappointing. But again, the way the NFL works. So, I mean, I've certainly stopped trying to predict usage based on talent. We are still betting on talent, but in any 1 or 2 week stretch, you're going to watch and be like, well, that's just the way things happen. This frustration. It's if every team approached it the way that the Dolphins approach it, then we would get rational decisions. We would get the right types of usage. We would get the elite talents being the focal point of offenses. We know that's not going to happen for 27, 28 teams. And we know that their owners are going to come out and complain that things were disrespectful. It's use your bad players more, respect the game. So anyway, we did get a lot of
shout out. This was a lot of fun watching this, but Adam Thielen as well, for somebody who's been in the league a long time, has had an incredible career from where he, when he came into this point. And I just thought it was a pretty cool watch along on Sunday. And like you mentioned, on none of our rosters, we were advising against it. So that can be a wrong one if people want to say that from our side. But this was fun to watch along. Shawn, we
yeah,
have
were
to
saying
mention
who's going to predict this, but I mean, Adam Thielen was getting drafted like in between rounds 11 and 14. So there were people who were like,
I just wasn't able to see
throw
him.
A pick on that.
I couldn't, my eyes, it didn't communicate that when his name came up that he was able to be drafted at that point. I didn't understand. But Shawn, you mentioned
he wasn't in your queue in a range where that was viable.
Okay. Certainly not. You mentioned the Cowboys and the Cardinals, and you said we're going to get to that game at some point. I think you said we're getting to it next, and we have never got to it. So 35 minutes later for people still tuning in. What's the good, the bad? What are you hitting me with here in the Cardinals game? Is it James Conner again?
Well, number one, James Conner. Another week. I did the rest of season running back rankings last week. That was a fun exercise. Obviously, you know that as soon as you put that up, people are going to prove you wrong very definitively. James Conner, I mean, he looked great in this game. And one of the things that I would mention here is that the aggressiveness on offense and the performance of the Cardinals in the second half of the first 2 weeks was frustrating, and it left you with the feeling that their coaching staff hadn't figured it out and or didn't trust the players. And this game is a reminder that we're just 3 weeks in, and that this new coaching staff is just 3 weeks into everything that they're trying to establish in Arizona. And for me, the biggest takeaway here was simply that this was not some kind of gigantic upset that was fueled by a lot of flukiness. I think if you look at the scores and you look at how Dallas's defense had performed in the first 2 weeks, and you think about the Arizona Cardinals, one of these teams where Vegas had projected them to be one of the worst all-time teams, you're thinking, okay, this is some kind of massive, epic upset. And yet when you watch the game, like, these teams are actually very even. Because number one, the Cardinals defense is for real. Now, playing as aggressively as they do, they are probably going
They're on the line.
Yeah, I mean, they're probably going to make some mistakes at some points. Again, you have a borderline, dirty play in this game, but this team is flying around. And the really stark contrast in this game was between sort of an old school style and or the old school as they're trying to adjust to 2023 defensive tendencies versus this young gun mentality. And one of the things here with Gannon, head coach of the Cardinals, is there was some criticism for him. There were jokes about, okay, well, the Eagles probably wanted to get rid of him in the first place. A little bit like what you hear all the time about Bieniemy with the Chiefs, that like they were good in spite of their defensive coordinator, that the Eagles had all of those sacks last season and had this, in many ways, historic type of defense to go with Jalen Hurts in that offense in spite of their defensive coordinator, as opposed to in some ways because of him. And then you watch how they performed through 3 weeks and you're thinking that is pretty bogus, right? I mean, they've got this team out there playing extremely hard. And the other note here that I think was so interesting is, number one, it was kind of crazy just how easily the Cardinals ran on Dallas, especially for the first sort of 3 quarters before Dallas got, more panicky, more aggressive and said, okay, we've got to stop you guys from converting first downs. We got to get the ball back because we're losing.
Do you think there's a chance here that the Cowboys, overlooked the Cardinals here, after they have a 40-0 win, they have a 30-10 win, they're kind of cruising, they don't really have to try in those 2 games against the 2 New York teams. Then they've Arizona here, then they would have had New England, San Francisco, and the LA Chargers coming up as their next 3 games. Do you think they may have mistakenly looked at this one as this is a win here and then hitting them out?
Again, not necessarily. In that when you watch the game itself, it didn't feel that way. It felt like you were watching 2 relatively even teams, with Arizona being slightly better coached or having the key plays. Because, again, this game was the Dolphins game was just so transcendent and swallows everything else up from this weekend. And in this game, the headline is, okay, Dallas choked and they did these weird things. They made mistakes and they lose to a team you simply cannot lose to. But that's not the truth of it. When you actually watch the game, they didn't play poorly. They played in a way that was too conservative and actually exposes some of the problems that the team has, which one of the problems that the team has is that Dak Prescott is just a guy at quarterback. I mean, he's just a
terrible
guy.
interception at the end of this game too.
Well, but before that, he'd actually made no significant mistakes, right? But
he
he
was
also hadn't
game
done
managing the situation.
But he hadn't done anything positive for the team either. No. And you could look at it with McCarthy also and say this is a big problem because they ran the ball a lot in this game, and Tony Pollard looked fantastic. And yet what it required and what that meant was the team then had to execute a lot of successful plays. And that's the thing we've been talking about, for over a year now, which is that you don't want to have to execute a lot of plays. You want to execute explosive plays. You look on the other side, and something that is not going to be sustainable, it's certainly not something you're going to see every week, but something that was very similar to what we saw with Miami was this Rondale Moore touchdown, right? You look at the things that Mostert did, you look at the things that A-Chain did, and you're just blown away by that, and you're thinking, okay, well, other teams simply can't do it. They don't have the speed. If you call the right play and you use the speed, and that was the thing that was so frustrating with Rondale Moore over the first couple of seasons, is that the Cardinals had figured out absolutely no way to get him in space. And you can say, well, okay, this is a breakdown by the Dallas defense. But one of the things that we witnessed here was a play call that was so similar to what we saw in the Miami game, where you have that handoff up the middle to a player with blazing speed. And that's one of the reasons that we've loved Rondale Moore, in addition to the crazy market share numbers when he was a young player in college. Not just a player in college, but a very young player in college. But Rondale Moore has breathtaking athleticism. If you're getting him the ball like out on the edge with the entire team's opposing defense there, which is what Cliff Kingsbury managed to do over and over and over, then what you get is a guy who has a basically zero ADOT, is also not getting a lot of after-catch yardage, and then you're getting these end-arounds, again, that are not that well designed. You contrast that with what they did in this game, where he gets the 45-yard touchdown and also was involved in a couple of key passing plays. I mean, the volume isn't there for him. He does have the 6 targets. He does still have that issue with the total yardage numbers, where he has 6 targets and only 8 yards as a receiver. But the ability of the Cardinals to create the big plays in this game. They have Michael Wilson, 2 catches, 86 yards. They have Marquise Brown, the 5 catches, the 61 yards, the touchdown at the end. Dallas had to grind for everything that they got. And Tony Pollard looked great in this game, and yet still was not a player who made an impact in it. And you just can't have your team and your game plan set up in a way that a player can do that, especially against a supposedly inferior opponent. You look at that, you look at the complete lack of involvement in CeeDee Lamb. And again, you're playing different teams, right? Arizona Cardinals are out there playing different defense, a different scheme. They have different incentives and different objectives than you have with the Pittsburgh Steelers playing the Las Vegas Raiders. But if the Dallas Cowboys
you got to get him more than 7 targets.
Yeah. I mean, if they're going to be the type of team that they think that they are, then he has to be involved like a Davante Adams. It can't be something where he has 7 targets and Tony Pollard has 23 carries.
There should never be a game where he has less than 10 targets. There should never be a game. Yeah.
Never.
And we talked last week, I don't know if it was on the show or after, but he looks like somebody who's ready to ascend to that elite level. And between the play calling and the quarterback play, that may be the things that hold him back. But 7 targets, 4 players on the team at 7 targets in this one, you need to be getting him involved more. And especially when you've trailed the entire game, you've been behind the entire way, you never get the lead. But you mentioned, Shawn, the plays leading to potential errors. We have a 10-play field goal drive for them, a 13-play drive that ends in a touchdown. Then the second half, it's 13 plays for a field goal, 8 plays turned over and downs, 12 plays for a field goal, 13 plays for that interception at the end of the game. We're taking far too long to try and move the ball down the field. We do not have to have a 12-minute drive before every score. We can try and be a little bit more explosive with it. But
one of the things too, where it'd be interesting to check out the SIS stats that we have and so many of the great tools, work through a lot of the things there to see if the visual impression turns out to be the case. But you think about another thing the Dolphins have, very publicly done. And when I say public, I just mean it's been a very high profile thing, talked about a lot, their willingness and their intent in attacking the middle of the field. This game, not just for CeeDee Lamb, but for so many of the receivers, was like that very worst time period of Derek Carr and Amari Cooper with the Raiders where every play was a difficult down the sideline pass where Cooper is being defended by the corner. In many cases, he's being defended by the safety over the top, and he's being defended by the sideline. And they keep running these plays and are surprised when a huge chunk of them do not work. I mean, Dak Prescott is not an elite quarterback in the first place. He's not going to elevate your receiving weapons, but give him a chance. Don't ask him to throw difficult pass after difficult pass after difficult pass. That's not the way to get the job done here. He's got too much to work with to be averaging 6 yards per attempt. Mike McCarthy has been a very good head coach. He's a good offensive mind. He's accomplished a lot. The first 2 weeks, I don't think, just get completely wiped away because they've lost to an Arizona Cardinals team that may end up being a good team. But this game really illustrated and underlined the questions and the concerns that people had with him when he fired or they allow Kellen Moore to go to the Chargers, especially when you contrast it with what the Chargers did this weekend.
Yeah, one of my fears with Mike McCarthy with this offense with the Cowboys is the concern was when his time in Green Bay got to the end, and for multiple years before that was that he had failed to innovate. And part of my concern now with this offense is, like you mentioned, with how the Raiders were running theirs, I think there might be a lack of innovation over the last couple of years with what he is looking to do. But that is going to get us to the end of today's show. I hope you've enjoyed listening along. Shawn mentioned it earlier, the contest we had previously. A few prizes were given out for people leaving ratings and reviews. We have no contest at this time, but please, if you haven't done so already, drop us a rating and review on your favorite podcast app. We would really appreciate that. If you're watching it over on the YouTube side, drop a comment down below with any topics you would like to see discussed on any future shows this week, or I guess in the future in general. You can sign up over at rotoviz.com, get access to all of Shawn's content, get access to the tools and all the other content that is up on the website. Use the code RVRadio2023 at checkout to get yourself a 10% discount. We will be back with our Wednesday edition of the show. We'll also have a Friday edition, so make sure you are subscribed to get all those shows once they are available. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at OverToMarlin. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. And until we are back, have a good one.